Thanks, Gwen. I think if we're just going to look at the different areas of what has been addressed here, is value is extremely important. Cost is a major part of this value. The question or the issue in front of us is immuno-oncology is extremely costly medicine or drugs. However, the outcome has been way better than anything else that we've seen before, and the promise for the future is very wide. However, the cost is going to be increasing further. So one, how can we decrease the cost of development? And big part of this could be actually regulatory, whether from a preclinical perspective or early development perspective, or whether we need 3+3 or all these kind of things. The second is how do we develop new model for pricing, which Greg mentioned a little bit. And the third, from a payer's perspective, and what Scott mentioned, can we actually take a deep breath and say, well, why rushing it in knowing that 70% are not going to be responding or 80% is not going to be responding? Can we wait until we know who's going to be responding and develop the biomarkers before we get into the market? And finally, from a patient's perspective that are waiting to see what can be done for me today and how I can extend my life for a few years, months, weeks, or whatever that value would be. So first, I'm going to be opening it up to the panel. If there are any questions, I'm sure, and comments that are relevant to other people's talk, and then we can ask questions and take from the floor. Lee.
Thank you all for your comments. I think this has been a great discussion. I just want to touch first on the overall costs of cancer care, and to put things a little bit in perspective is that the cost of medications or anti-cancer therapies is really only one piece of the overall cost of cancer care, and it's predicted about 20% of that cost. So, and certainly there are a lot of other areas where we could look at cost control with regards to that, and the PET scan was a good example. I think PET scans are probably one of the more overused tests in various different scenarios. But that being said, I think there are various ways that all of the people, at least on this end of the table, are trying to reduce our costs, and some of those were addressed. I think biomarkers are very important. I think, at least for the area of checkpoint inhibitors, this is an area of very intense investigation. And I think that there will be more on that, and a lot of work being done to try to identify those patients who are most likely to benefit. I think there are issues with regards to duration of therapy that we can address, and I think that there are even other more minor things such as the vial size that can be addressed, and these things are being worked on. The other topic I wanted to touch on was the issue of the clinical trials, and I couldn't agree more that providing more opportunities for patients to go on clinical trials is really critical. Lee Schwartzberg from the prior session mentioned our work with the IO ICON group. This is a network of community centers that is working with BMS to do some of their studies, so trying to encompass more community centers into the clinical trial arena and make these novel treatments available to more patients. And also, we had a meeting actually just a few weeks ago that was run by Longevity. They coordinated a meeting that brought academic people, industry, and FDA representatives together to open that dialogue about clinical trial endpoints, about trying to streamline them, maybe make it the eligibility criteria a little more broad for more patients to be enrolled, and also simplifying the process so that data can be collected more quickly, and that these trials can be done in a more streamlined and more efficient and less costly way.
So I have a question for James. When you said that CMS looks at clinically meaningful benefit from the patient's perspective, how do you measure that? How do you determine what is meaningful from a patient perspective?
Well, basically, one of the things that you can do is give them a quality of life measurement tool at the time prior to as well as after treatment, just to make sure that their quality of life does not suffer. So that's one of the measures that you can use. Number two, you can poll your patients, find out exactly what's important to them. And it may turn out that certain patients may say, well, I know what kind of illness I have, and I don't want to go any further. So I think that you've got to get the input from the patient's perspective to make sure that the treatment that they're getting, not only does it improve their outcome in the long run, but from their perspective, they feel that they're getting something out of it.
And so how do you integrate that information into your decision making?
Well, actually, one of the things that I talked about earlier was the coverage with evidence development. And as part of that process, we do incorporate questions from the patient's perspective so that that type of information can be captured. It's one thing to document the fact that people are living longer, but if their quality of life has not improved or actually has gotten worse, then you kind of wonder what's it all about, especially when you look at the cost. But as I said, we don't look directly at information about cost, but it's captured indirectly.
David, you have some things to.
Yeah, I was actually gonna respond to some of the things that Lee Newcomer had said earlier. I think one thing about sort of the era of combination immunotherapy is that it is going to come to maturity, in that time frame where these value issues are really going to become even more in the forefront of everyone's minds than they are now. And so the approach to that has to really be very much around unambiguous benefit for combinations. Right now, there are hundreds of combos that are currently under evaluation, and most of them are novel combos, though every standard of care agent is also being re-envisioned as an immunotherapy. But the cost of all those novel combos is going to be, with sort of current pricing models and current approaches, extremely high. If we think about the ideal state from how we want science to drive this process, and that's how we aspire to think about this at Merck, we would be able to really delineate patients who are going to have unambiguous benefit and even cure from PD-1 monotherapy. We will be able to predict patients who weren't likely to respond from that and understand which combos those patients would respond to. We would be able to develop those combos then in an efficient way under a good regulatory paradigm that would allow us to very rapidly bring those combos to the patients who are likely to benefit. And we would be able to, with that unambiguous evidence of benefit, very rapidly march these combos up to first line or early lines of therapy, where we could avoid the cost of other therapies that weren't as effective. But to effect that, we don't have really a community infrastructure right now that supports the type of research that we need to do to get there. And I'm not suggesting that when we talk about reaching into the community that we just put that on others. I think that Merck and other pharmaceutical players have a real responsibility to work with the community to try to build those kinds of networks. But if we're going to run enrichment studies, we need to create an infrastructure where we can reach the patients who have the right biology. And to do that requires really good communication with the community, evidence gathering from the community, and that requires not just physician engagement, but patient engagement. It requires using some of the tools that are being developed in the informatics space that really allow patients to interact with their data, with other patients, and ultimately with the companies that are running and the academics that are running clinical trials.
David, that's good and well, but how would you put this into practice? I mean, that's very important, but at the end, it needs to be implemented. So is it easy to implement, you think? And if it is so, how would you take that forward?
I think that's difficult. I mean, we're already approaching this. So we've announced registrational trials in microsatellite unstable colorectal cancer. And that requires finding not rare patients, but it does require an enrichment strategy. So we've been thinking about it there as well as in other contexts. I think this is a space that has a huge amount of activity. There are major players like IBM and Google and others. There are very other established players like Flatiron and Foundation Medicine who bring pieces of this puzzle, but no one has put together there are groups like Patients Like Me who are patient-facing. There are a lot of groups in the space, but no one has sort of put together all the pieces in a way that's going to support what we're talking about if this is really the future. I think, and as I mentioned yesterday, I think in the question session, I think that there's a public interest in creating this space as well as private interest in understanding what's going to be pretty competitive in the public domain around these efforts and what's going to be in the private domain is something that's going to be really interesting to see.
And again, I think from a policy perspective, this is one of those things that could be put forward as an incentive for such programs and such cooperation that might put those pieces together that we really need to think about as an outcome, at least from this particular workshop or from others. But I think this would be a major part of what can be done.
Yeah, and I think
We've got
one
a guy sitting here in the front row who did it with gene mutations. The paper trial is a great example of
Yeah,
what's
that's right.
possible.
Yeah.
I'm not going to let you off the hook, David. This has been an issue for a decade, and your industry hasn't done anything to move the infrastructure forward. Quite frankly, you like it insular because you've never collaborated with one another on novel drugs before until it finally became economically viable for you. So I'm saying you've got some responsibility here, and you guys need to make that happen. Because sitting around talking about the fact that drugs are only 20% of the equation, they're actually 30, and they're growing to 50 in the next 5 years, and saying we're not really the issue is not true. And you need to help step up and build the infrastructure that gets these trials done quickly.
So on that note,
Can I respond to that actually?
sure.
Okay. Yeah. So first of all, I'm gonna only speak to the science because I don't want to overstep, my knowledge and my role. What I'll say to you is that I actually think that we're in a place. If you look at that enthusiasm curve, I think for precision medicine, it kind of went up and down. And I actually think we're getting back up onto a plateau phase. And it may be that the volume of clinical translational research that we're doing in immuno-oncology is just what's needed to drive that future. I also think that there's now a convergence between immuno-oncology and classical oncology in terms of understanding how the oncogenic pathways drive the tumor immune microenvironment.
Yep.
And that brings us back to all the tools that have been developed for precision medicine and oncology becoming relevant for immuno-oncology. So I actually think that we're in a state where we actually, I think, really, the starting point for this discussion is it should be possible to delineate the patients who are going to derive the most benefit from the different agents that are going to be in the armamentarium in the space. That should be the starting point. And if it's possible, then I think we are all together, and it has to be a community effort, on the hook for figuring out how that's possible. I think that the starting point is collaboration at a company-to-company level. And, Merck has announced over 40 company-to-company clinical collaborations in this space. This is unprecedented. So the nature of company-to-company collaboration in the space is indicative of a paradigm shift for how we approach this space. I hope that extends to other aspects of this. But from my perspective, I think we have a scientific starting point that does make it possible to bring a new corporate strategy to how we approach these issues. I just think it takes the input of a lot of other players in the space, and it certainly takes different regulatory paradigms in order to support those types of changes.
Can I talk just briefly about the price?
Just 1 second.
Okay.
If Lee wants to respond to this particular issue or a different thing.
I just had a question for you, actually, so I'll let you put it in your comments. How come we don't price penicillin on a cure model for diplococcal pneumonia?
All right, so good. Thank you for that setup, because I was going to say that we really, if we're going to talk about it, if this session's on value, we've got to talk about the price of these drugs. And I'm arguing that the pricing model for oncology drugs is broken, badly broken, and it's hurting us as a society. And we've got to face that. I'll give you a little anecdote, and unfortunately I can't name names here, but someone I know in the health economics department of a very large pharmaceutical manufacturer in the oncology division called me up and said, I got a problem, Dr. Ramsey. I contracted with a group to build a cost-effectiveness model to show the value of this oncology product. And it wasn't great, but it was pretty good. But that was 3 years ago, and my company's raised the price of that product every quarter till now, and now it doesn't show any value at all. And what do you think I should do about that? And I said, oh, that's easy. You just increase the effectiveness of the product every quarter, and you'll be fine. But, you know, that isn't happening. The price of Gleevec, since when it was introduced, has tripled. And it's now on par with the second generation TKIs for CML. And I can guarantee you the cost of manufacturing Gleevec has not tripled. It's gone down, if anything. So, you know, these prices are not being set based on what health economists recognize as value. They're being set based on what the manufacturers think the market will bear. And right now, they're finding out that the market will bear quite a lot, but it isn't going to last forever. It's not a supportable model. And until we start facing that reality, I'm worried that the access to these immunotherapies is going to be curtailed, a promising therapy, because we're going to have to do something, and it may be more severe than it's really necessary.
So Scott, thanks for the setup, because before I open up to the floor, the point is absolutely correct. And going back to Lee Krug's, yes, I agree, it is 20% now, but it will be 50%. There are not many drugs that we had before that will cost $500,000 to extend the person's life 5 years, because now their lives are being extended 5 years and will go forward. And this is only a monotherapy, not combination. So it will go back to the pharmaceuticals to think of different models. And Greg, you mentioned about potential new model for pricing, and I'd like to hear from you what the thought is, at least at this stage, from your perspective.
Yeah, so I think in the US there's a number of examples of sort of outcomes-based contracting. Certainly in Europe, we're starting to sort of get very significantly into this. So if you look at Italy, for example, you know, you really have a sort of pay-for-response model for the majority of therapies that enter the Italian market. And we use, if you like, sort of clinical definition of progression as opposed to a sort of a CT scan, you know, radiological sort of progression. So if there's continuation of therapy, we'll assume that there's a benefit to the patient, because oncologists, you know, aren't going to withdraw a therapy that's benefiting patients. And so you can use those sorts of frameworks and say, well, you know, if I don't have a biomarker, if I don't have a good responder analysis, I can use a poor man's responder analysis, which is if you're continuing therapy after, let's say, 3 months, then I'll assume that there's a benefit that's being accrued, and I will be able to claw back or rebate the, you know, either partial or full funds associated with anyone who progresses within that first 3 months. So those sorts of models are being looked at. We just been looking at things like episode of care payment models, you know, a full sort of treatment cap. So, and particularly I think in the case of immuno-oncology, where, you know, we have no idea what the total treatment duration, because, you know, the majority of the costs are not going to be on the median patient. The majority of the costs are going to be on the population that basically extends treatment sort of for 2, 3, 4 years, depending on what the cessation looks like. So how do we sort of manage those types of outcomes? I was intrigued, and we've done some modeling as well, Scott, as to using an adjuvant-like framework for immuno-oncology and metastatic disease, because that's effectively what we're saying. So if I basically say that, you know, after a point in time, I will assume some level of normal life expectancy. Effectively, that's what a cure model is. We do that for adjuvant therapies, and we know that many adjuvant therapies are in fact cost effective. They're not cost effective necessarily in the metastatic setting at certain prices, but they are cost effective when we move to a 3-year DFS. With if you survive through 3 years, we're going to assume a normal life expectancy. So those sorts of models exist and are available. But there are still challenges. And I think that as we move aggressively into the earlier stages of treatment, first line, for example, there are a series of issues that we're going to face around how we use surrogates, time to first and second subsequent treatment rather than overall survival. How do we manage crossover in these settings? What is that sequencing trial option look like? These are going to be real difficult, both clinical development challenges, but also modeling challenges. And then you have the question about who holds the risk in terms of the health system, or whether it's the pharma, and how do we share that risk through these contracting options, I think is the only way for us to start this having a viable conversation.
All right, let's move to Jay. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, Jay Brzezowski from NCI.
Can you get the microphone?
Jay Brzezowski from NCI. I wanted to ask a few minutes ago about this assumption about the cost of these drugs, because until the last few minutes of discussion, all the discussion was based on what is the value to the patient or to society, to Medicare, whatever, to justify spending this much money. And there was this underlying assumption that the high cost of these therapies was fixed and we just had to accept it. But it seems to me that cost is usually a function of supply and demand, and in the pharmaceutical industry, high costs are often justified by high developmental costs. But those high developmental costs are all spent up front, and then as a product is used more widely and for a longer period of time, those costs get amortized over time, and the cost of goods should really go down and not up. So the Gleevec example that was brought up a few minutes ago is a case in point. I mean, there's absolutely no reason why something like that should keep going up in price when, in fact, the cost of development was years ago. So is there any thought about really pricing these more based on the real cost of goods as well as development, and not what the market will bear because the alternative treatment for cancer is also expensive, so we can justify charging $100,000 for an antibody or whatever? It seems to me that that's the wrong pricing model, and we shouldn't just accept it.
So you're talking about a free market, which doesn't exist in healthcare. In 42 states, I am mandated to cover an FDA-approved drug no matter what the cost. I cannot say in a situation, let's take CML, 5 agents. I'm not going to cover 2 of them because I'm going to have a bidding contest to see which 3 come in with lower costs. It would be classic economics. Even Scott would love me to do that, but it would be illegal. And now, as you watch, there are a number of laws being introduced with sponsorship from manufacturers saying we're not going to allow sequencing or a requirement to use one drug before you move on to the second one either. There are now several states considering that legislation. So again, if you come to the CML example, you couldn't say, we want you to use product A first, because if you look at the response rates to the agents, they're all very close. You can't use agent A and then go to agent B. That's now trying to be made illegal as well. So there is no free market. And so the things that we talk about classically that you just described don't apply until that market opens up.
So just put this on the table, of course, because you always hear this. The cost for drug development is very high too. I mean, for a company, it might take 1,000, 10,000 drugs to develop until it gets to one drug that works on the market. Second, if the companies might not be generating revenues, it would be very difficult for a company X, like Merck, for example, to do 420 or 450, I don't know what the number was, clinical trials that are fully funded with new ideas for combinations, etc. So I'm putting this on the table because that's the other part of the equation that we always hear about, and I would like to hear
in the New York Times today, that number is 17% of total revenues at Big Pharma. 17%.
I would argue that
I actually meant to hear it from the companies, not from.
Oh, well, I mean, I think you know what the companies are going to say, right? I mean, it is expensive to develop drugs, but I would argue that the cost of developing drugs is not going up commensurate with the prices increases that we're seeing. You know, a lot of these drugs, as we've heard, are going through accelerated review, which, if anything, is reducing the cost of development because they don't have to go all the way to the phase 3 trials. I think the one thing that is different about immunotherapies is the cost of goods is much higher than it is for drugs that are just manufactured like pills or chemicals. And that was part of Dendrion's undoing, is that their cost of goods was so high. We heard about that product, sickle cell C, yesterday too. And that is going to be an ongoing issue for pharma, although I would argue, and we heard about it a little bit this morning, that they can gain efficiencies in manufacturing as they learn about this process. And they will over time. So the cost of developing CAR T drugs and other immunotherapies over time, I would argue, is going to go down. The cost of manufacturing, I'm sorry, not developing. So I don't think we don't know very well about what the costs of development are, but to say that they're high enough to support the prices, I think is wrong.
Can I just, before you go to the pharma side, just make a comment about access and patient benefit? Because I think there's, and this goes beyond immuno-oncology, but I think there's this idea that all patients want access to all drugs no matter what the cost. And I think that's really false. That is really false. I think there is a the cost discussion is not transparent. Most patients do not have conversations with their physicians or their healthcare providers about cost, and people make different decisions based on different values. So for some people, a benefit of a few months at a huge cost, either to their family, to their society, to their quality of life, is not worth it. And to other people, the possibility of living for 3 months longer is what they consider to be of most benefit to their family and society. So I think it troubles me, because I'm in these conversations a lot, when people speak as if there is a one voice and a unilateral approach or idea of what patients want and what patients see as benefit from drugs. So thank you.
Thanks. So again, there's some very large issues that span all of cancer and all of medicine that are being discussed here. And I'll want to just bring some of this down just to the immuno-oncology realm around development. I think that immuno-oncology is different than a lot of areas of cancer research, in that we really don't understand how these drugs are working. We put up nice cartoons, we have some idea, but the complexity here is orders of magnitude beyond, here's a pathway, you drug it with this drug, and that's how it works. And the combinatorial diversity that we're going to need to explore to really effect a future state where more patients are getting cured up front, which is really ultimately what we're trying to do. It's going to take an enormous amount of investment in iterative clinical and preclinical and bioinformatic research that's beyond what usually goes on around a single drug after it's been approved in a couple of indications. So I do think that the research endeavor here is particularly intense. It's why we've, at least at Merck, devoted sort of unprecedented resources to funding academic research, as well as I mentioned earlier, in setting up collaborations with the companies.
Thanks, Rich Shilsky from ASCO. So actually, I had what I thought was going to be kind of an off-the-wall question, but Greg already brought up the point of thinking about the value of immuno-oncology therapies, perhaps in the mindset of adjuvant treatment. And I wanted to just expand on that for a minute. If you think about it, we pretty much accept at face value that adjuvant chemotherapy in those diseases where the randomized trials have proven its effectiveness, we accept at face value that that's a high-value therapy, despite the fact that many people who get it don't need it because they're already cured. We can't tell who those people are. We have no way of monitoring effectively whether the treatment is effective or not, because the patient has no evidence of disease when they begin the treatment. The therapy can only cause side effects and diminish quality of life because the patient is generally asymptomatic when they begin the treatment. And yet, we sort of accept the notion that it's okay to treat everybody in the relevant population to benefit what is generally a small percentage of individuals who will have long-term benefit from adjuvant treatment. We're beginning to see some of these same issues begin to emerge with the immunotherapies, in the sense that we recognize now that there is a small percentage of any of these treatment populations where patients will derive long-term benefit. But the majority of patients will not. We can't yet decide who's in which group. We're confronted with the notion of treating everybody to try to get that benefit, that long-term benefit for the few. So I just wonder, and I'd actually, Greg started it. I'd love to hear Scott's sort of thoughts about it as well, because it seems to me that maybe we need to begin to move the assessment of value in immuno-oncology into a framework that is more similar to the way we think about adjuvant treatment than the way we think about conventional, cytotoxic therapy or even TKI therapy for metastatic disease.
Greg, your name was mentioned in the debate, so you can talk.
I think I'm glad, Rich, that you sort of picked up on it. All these learned professors here in my swimming certificate. It's glad to see there's some concepts that resonate. I think that it's clearly something. There's a lot of analogous sort of framework and thinking. I think that the idea about how we have patient selection and where the biomarkers fit, I think is one complexity, although you have it to some degree in the adjuvant. And I think the other question is what do we do with the sequencing of therapy and the lines of therapy as we go through? And I think that's a little different, and that's a more complex modeling framework, because these people do have oftentimes bulky disease, and there's very significant, I think, both clinical outcomes cost as well as economic cost as you go through. So I think that's where we've got to get to our thinking, but I think it's the right model to start thinking, and we need to design trials that help us put those assumptions, those inputs into the model so that we can articulate that better.
Scott?
So, and I do want to, I mean, there are ways we can improve upon this. I mean, take the pricing model and improve upon this problem that we face with immuno-oncology as well as standard oncology, which is less than a third of patients will have meaningful responses, and we can't predict who those are. Greg mentioned a model that in economic circles is kind of called pay-for-performance. So the manufacturer will, the payer will pay, but if there is no response, then they get a rebate for the patient. And I think that is one way to address the problem. That allows manufacturers to get paid for when the product works and paid less when it doesn't work. So that's I do think that is a potential outcome. There also are improvement. There also are, there are going to be technological solutions. We are going to find better markers. Breast cancer, we're getting better at predicting who needs chemotherapy and who doesn't. And I think, as we develop biomarkers, that will improve in, immunological therapy as well. But that's a technical solution. It still doesn't address the pricing problem and the aggressive increasing of prices that we're dealing with in oncology right now.
Pat?
Patty Gans, UCLA. So I've held my tongue the whole day and a half, but I had to say something about the issue because patient education came up in the last session, physician education came up. Gwen talked about how patients they have big gaps in their information, but also they value communication. And I think one of the big challenges is that our payment models do not allow physicians and patients to have the time to communicate about this. Physicians don't yet have the language about immuno-oncology and the knowledge when we think about, I was kind of appalled when Amy showed her slides about the dissemination of some of these therapies in the lung cancer in the community, in her database from Flatiron. Those 171 practices may be early adopters, but clearly these agents are getting out there very quickly into the oncology community. And if a patient comes in with advanced cancer and needs to have a conversation about do they sequence their tumor to see if there's a mutation that might put them on one of these trials that is open, or go on an immune therapy that might be indicated? I'm talking about a lung cancer patient as an example. So, where is the time to have that discussion? Where are the skills? And again, if you look at our IOM report from 2013, we really called for that kind of conversation. And if you just think about the 600,000 people who die from cancer in the United States each year, how many of them had a decent, informative dialogue with their physician before they died about what their therapeutic choices are. So we need to find a way, and I'm looking at CMS as well, because the majority of these individuals are older individuals who are insured by CMS. And I know we're going to have the oncology care model, but we need a way to somehow capture those discussions to make sure those discussions are actually going on so that patients are offered choices, can go on expanded access trials, on registries, and that we don't lose that valuable information. But we have to somehow compensate the physician for having that discussion when the patient might not go on chemotherapy and there's not going to be any extra reimbursement for that. So I think this is a very central problem to delivering patient-centered care. We can have the greatest drugs, but they're not going to get out to the patients. There's going to be an older patient with lung cancer in the community who doesn't get referred in for an immunotherapy that may be very helpful. And these are big challenges. So I wonder what the panel thinks.
Yes, from CMS's perspective, another activity that we're currently in the process of putting in place is shared decision-making. And shared decision-making would give that opportunity for the patient to communicate with his or her provider to decide exactly on where they're going in terms of treatment. Now, I can't speak for how much CMS is going to reimburse for that activity because that is not in an area that I'm associated with, but I do know that those types of discussions are taking place to address those issues.
Richard Woodman, Novartis. I have a question, and then I'd like to have a follow-up with a comment regarding Gleevec. My question is for Dr. Ramsey. First of all, I was very intrigued about the cure probability estimates. That model, I think, has some real potential uses, particularly for certain cancers, and I think there may be other surrogates like treatment-free intervals that may be very applicable, as many of our cancers now are becoming chronic diseases. The question I have, and we've tried to do this for CML, is define cure. That may seem like a very simple question, but as you start to think about it, is it cure without toxicity, cure without disability? Does it mean simply discontinuing therapy? You know, what exactly do we mean by cure? And I think the other important question is for health authorities, you know, would they ever accept a definition of cure for registration studies, for pivotal studies? So I'd like to ask the panel if they have any thoughts on this concept of defining cure.
Anyone would like to define cure? Scott, do you want to talk?
I don't think health economists are the right group to answer this, but I do think, in oncology, my understanding, if patients have no evidence of recurrent disease after 5 years, that they're off, that's often one benchmark. Is that true?
But how is that going to be? What is the point? What are you trying to accomplish from defining the word, and how did you think about it?
Well, we thought that there are some cancers where you have minimal residual disease. And by that definition, you can't really say their cancer is eradicated. But in every other context, operationally, they're cured. They're off therapy. They have no unwanted toxicities from the prior therapy. They have a good quality of life. And although, in fact, in some cases, the discontinuation of therapy from some people's perspective may not necessarily be permanent. And so does that have value? Even though they've still got some residual disease, it's not causing any symptoms, they're living normal lifespan, etc. Could we ever have that as an endpoint moving forward?
Yep.
So maybe I can comment. So if we look at, if you like, case law versus stated law, I think in health economics, when do we trigger a assumption of age and gender matched standard life expectancy in our model? Because that's effectively what we're saying. When we do that, we're saying you have got an equivalent set of outcomes to an age-matched, gender-matched cohort of patients. And we do that in the adjuvant setting using either a 3-year or a 5-year disease-free survival estimate, depending on which disease we're in, whether it's breast cancer or colon cancer or what have you. And that, I would argue, is a pragmatic definition of cure in that setting. I think you could establish similar sort of assumption-based approaches here for sort of value assessment, even if it's not, absolutely sort of accurate. I think you could say, okay, if I get to 3-year or 5-year relapse-free survival, does that make it functionally cured from a sort of value assessment point of view?
So would you like to comment on the Gleevec?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your comments. My comment about Gleevec is the cost of manufacture may rise minimally at the time of the initial approval, but the value of a drug can change. And I think Gleevec is a great example. When it was first approved for CML, the true impact on overall survival and cure was in fact not appreciated. Over the subsequent decade, and there have been several publications from very numerous independent groups that demonstrated that the survival of CML on Gleevec is equivalent to age gender-matched populations. CML patients are now dying of other things, not their CML.
But I think this is exactly the point that is being tried to be made, is that the cost of the drug is exactly the same. However, the way we're taking drugs, which I'm not sure it's inappropriate or appropriate, I'm just not commenting, is whether the two cars would cost the same, but you're driving a Chevy or a Mercedes, you have to pay for the luxury. Is this what you're trying to?
Well, I think there's some value that wasn't appreciated when the drug was first priced and approved, is one point. The second thing is that at the initial, over the last decade, Gleevec has subsequently been approved for 8 other cancers. And so you have a drug that's now approved for multitude of cancers, has a total of 9 indications, and many of them are rare diseases, with now in CML, life expectancy that equals age and gender matched population. That's my only comment, and certainly I welcome any comments from the panel.
But this and the previous question about the duration of cure, how you would define it, still implies that the price of the product ought to be based on the rest of that patient's life. And I think what Scott and I are both saying is that model isn't sustainable. We've got to find a different way to price drugs that doesn't soak up all if you will, all the other economic benefits. That's the point.
I couldn't agree that we need novel approaches.
I mean, the other comment is that the second generation TKIs came out at triple the price of imatinib,
yep.
And we don't yet have evidence that they're clearly superior. They have better response rates in terms of the level of disease. But if your argument is that when we see that prolonged survival, then we can charge more, then why are you charging so much more for new drugs before the evidence is there?
And again,
All right, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt this. Since this is not a TKI workshop, I'm just going to move forward on this one. Thank you, David. That's right. Elad, you're actually before Rami, so you could go first.
Well, so thanks very much. I wanted to throw a little bit of a lifeline out to Lee and David, who both of whose companies actually do have collaborative research and development agreements with the NCI, and who previously were both at institutions that we work with very extensively at Dana-Farber and at Memorial Sloan Kettering. I think the point is that if we're talking about a value proposition, value is something that we may be able to do to obtain through greater research and more work with companies. What we need, I think, for the public health infrastructure is we need to actually get access to many agents that are in pipelines at a variety of companies earlier, so that we can do some of the combinatorial work through the infrastructure and actually get answers faster and help patients quite a bit more. And so I would encourage, we're happy to work with pembrolizumab and nivolumab and atezolizumab and durvalumab. We have them all in our portfolio. We have many other agents that are all able to be combined without having separate agreements between companies, because you just have to have the agreement with the NCI. But that said, we do need more. We need more support from companies in order to actually get some of this work done. We need more of an effort on biomarkers and computational biology, and that's something where we're actually working towards. And we need access to these agents a little bit earlier than what we've been receiving up to this point.
So just a comment about the cure discussion. I don't think that we are there yet. I don't think that with the available therapies, we can say that we are curing cancer patients with immunotherapy. It's our inspiration, but we're not there yet. When we start evaluating those agents, we really need to start changing the way that we're assessing them. If we are in a disease setting where the life expectancy of patients is 6 months, and we're seeing patients who have disease stabilization that's lasting for a year, I think that's a benefit to a patient. But to start looking at it, whether we are curing the cancer or not, I think it's, again, we want to be there, and maybe that's what will happen with combinations, but we're not there yet. With regards to the cost, one of the things that, again, we have to start thinking about is changing our approach of clinical trial. And again, I'm speaking as a clinical trialist. The way that we are designing and running clinical trials right now is cost prohibitive. If we look at the lung cancer, the frontline studies, on average, the size of a frontline lung cancer study is anywhere between 1,500 to 2,000 patients. Again, there were comments about how quickly those agents are advancing from phase 1 to phase 3, but that's what's leading this to happen is that the phase 3 studies now have 6 arms. We're trying to still understand, is it monotherapy, is it combination with chemotherapy, is it immunotherapy combination? So the size of the phase 3 studies are becoming so huge because many of the questions about patient selection, biomarkers, some safety are being addressed in the context of the phase 3 studies. So I think we really need to start pausing and thinking about what can we do before we reach the phase 3 study so that we don't end up with the 6-arm randomized phase 3 studies. And if we have to do it, we need to start thinking together about an adaptive design where some of those arms can be dropped early on so that, again, we're not exposing patients to potentially what could be an ineffective single agent. So I think we have to really start rethinking the design of the studies that we are doing so that we're not in that situation with very large studies.
So what is holding you?
So part of it is some regulatory requirements. Because we have not characterized the activity of monotherapy in a randomized study, so you have to do it in the context of the phase 3 study. But we need to start introducing some adaptive designs that we can drop some of those arms. And again, agencies have been very open giving us feedback early on to try to really use those adaptive designs. But so far, based on all the studies that I have seen, we're still doing the 6-arm randomized studies and trying to get the answer from the phase 3.
It's a feeling on the table also that you have an issue, and what is holding really changing that paradigm into a more or faster paradigm?
Yeah, I have a couple of comments to follow up on that. Thanks, Rami. With regards to the whole topic of cure and so forth, I think I agree we're not quite there yet, but I think that the paradigm has shifted now such that the treatments that we're seeing, at least with the immunotherapy, they're not the incremental benefits that maybe we saw in the past when brought up. Patients may be reluctant to pay for a therapy that improves their survival by a month or two, but we're talking about the potential for therapies that can extend patients' lives much longer than that, and these responses are much more durable. So, it was already brought up that we need to make sure that models that would involve pricing really take that type of information into consideration, and that we don't create an environment where we're stifling innovation, and the innovation comes with developing combination therapies and all the work that needs to be done to increase the benefits that we're already seeing. Obviously, we have a lot of work to do. With regards to the clinical trials aspect, I had brought up a similar comment before, and I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that area, and the high costs of running those clinical trials it does then end up translating into the higher cost for medications down the line.
Okay, so we're over time already. I'm going to take the other last two questions, and then we'll close up.
Sure, just a real quick sort of a comment, I guess, to lead to a path forward. My name is Ron Klein. I'm from CMS. I work on the oncology care model. So obviously, in terms of your discouragement about how do you incentivize value in drug choices when you have state legislatures that inhibit that choice, obviously a bundled payment model, does give providers and patients, a value incentive to work on picking effective, high-value therapy. The oncology care model has incorporated the 13-point questionnaire from the IOM report, 17, 13, one of those. And if I had a nickel for every time a stakeholder complained about having to do that report, I'd be in a warmer place with water and sand. But nevertheless, it's there. And then just as a side point, oncology care model is aware of additional costs associated with clinical trials, and we want to encourage clinical trial enrollment, so stay tuned. Thanks.
Okay, Debbie?
So I have a question for Dr. Rollins and Dr. Newcomer, which is, you mentioned coverage with evidence development. It seems to have great potential, but it's relatively underdeveloped. Particularly in the oncology space, with respect to learning from what happens after these products enter the market and are used very quickly with lots of enthusiastic exuberance in the somewhat off-label setting. What can be done to accelerate learning from every patient? I mean, can you guys cooperate? Can we help you? How can we work together so that we can learn better from the experience of patients who were treated not on the early phase clinical trials, but right after these products become available?
I'll address it from CMS's perspective. Coverage with evidence development has been in place for about 10 years, and there are and initially, when we started the process, most of the studies that we approved were registries, but we found out that all that was being reported was data, and it really was not able to draw any kind of conclusion in terms of improved outcomes. So we have evolved from registries to, I'm going to say, prospective clinical studies, and that gives different research groups alternatives or options in terms of coming up with a design that they feel might answer the research questions that we pose. Now, as far as oncology agents, actually, there was only one national coverage determination that we addressed, and it did not result in a coverage with evidence development. That does not necessarily mean that if we get approached in the future by another oncology agent, that doesn't mean that we would not come with the conclusion of, yes, let's go ahead and do a CED to answer the specific questions to address Medicare's concerns. So as far as we're concerned, if a company, I'm not saying if a company wants a CED, if a company wants to be covered, and if the decision is, it's promising, let's go with the coverage of the evidence development, then that type of conversation can take place and move forward.
So Deb, I think we actually do have an answer for you. We began an online prior authorization process last June, and it uses the NCCN guidelines. So you have to input enough clinical data to get to a decision treatment node, and then every single recommended treatment from the NCCN is displayed, and you can choose any of them. Turns out that now created for us a national registry. So we have taken that clinical set of facts, that regimen which was chosen, linked it to claims data, and beginning Q1 of next year, when you go on that site to select the regimen, you will see the performance data of each and every regimen in exactly the same population of patients. So it's my hope that that data will begin to influence selection of regimens and treatments. And it will be a live document. It's continually updated. We intend to make the data available both to researchers and to other folks. It will not be proprietary to UHC, but it will be on our online prior auth tool. Just to give you an example, when we looked at Avastin about 2 years after marketing release, we found that 30% of the patients who received the drug got it for 1 month. So it was kind of a last right. And that's what I'm hoping to avoid is patients and physicians could start to see how well some of these drugs performed in situations exactly like theirs.
So,
Debbie, we have to stop because the NCPF boss told me that we have to stop. So, at the end, this has really been very, very stimulating. I really would like to thank the panel for all your input and everyone that participated in this workshop. I truly believe that this is a great workshop. I'm hoping that we have a good product out of it. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks for everyone.